Welcome to Liberty and Logos. This is Bellamy Fitzpatrick. This is episode 2, and we're calling it How Did We Get Here? And so in the last episode, we talked a little bit about why we're doing this show and what the motivations someone might have for questioning dominant narratives and seeking out liberation. And we think with this episode that we want to just talk a little bit about who we are, because one of the things we talked about in the last episode is which sources should you trust and why should you trust them. And part of that was knowing where someone's coming from, what their biases are, what their agenda is, what their motivations are for being a media source. And so we are going to now have a bit of dialogue where we ask each other questions about where we've come from and why we've gotten here. And you and I know each other pretty well, but we will probably actually learn some things about each other in this episode.
Yeah, I look forward to that. I think that there's a sense in which it kind of makes most sense to unpack the stuff in approximate chronological order, but at the same time, you know, some things are more important than others. To that end, why don't you tell me about the first time? Sounds like you're on the couch and I'm your psychotherapist. Why don't you tell me about the first time that you can remember now, the first time ever being confronted by something and really questioning, well, what is this? And maybe, probably in your childhood, but can you remember what it would have been?
Yeah, I think I can. So I grew up in the Midwest and in basically a kind of, I guess, center-left Democrat voting home. I was raised half-heartedly Catholic by my family, but I was never confirmed because they gave me the choice of whether I wanted to do that. And by that time, I'd become a kind of, obviously this was way before the new atheists, but I had a worldview that was probably a less obnoxiously aggressive version of a new atheist view of being. I was very much interested in science as a kid. I was always reading about the non-human world and spending time outside. And I remember the first time in which I did anything that could be a kind of cultural questioning, deep cultural questioning, was probably only about 6 years old. And I lived in the suburbs, and which I think is, in retrospect, I think it's just about the worst way a kid can grow up in terms of urban versus rural versus suburban. I think suburban is the worst. And there were not many real woods near where I lived, but there was one patch of woods that you had to walk probably about a mile and a half to get to. And they unexpectedly, to me, clear-cut the woods and basically expanded the suburbs into them. And I was so shocked when this happened. And I remember going home crying and talking to my father about it, and he said to me something like, I don't remember it exactly because it was so long ago, but something like, it's right that you're upset. What they did was wrong. And I think that was the first kind of real time that I can remember, at least. Of course, we do all this sort of revisionism on ourselves, but remember
Did your siblings feel the same?
Yeah.
Or the children you were hanging out with, you were not a lone voice in this respect?
No. I remember that my brother felt the same. I don't remember interacting with other kids with respect to it. The way that it worked, I didn't. Most of the kids that lived right around me were not kids I went to school with. So,
okay.
Yeah. So, yeah, and I think, growing older, having some of those same convictions, I eventually hit a point as a teenager, maybe in late what we call middle school in the United States. And then early high school. So, being around 13, 14, 15, and starting to realize that this system that we had with this industrial corporate state capitalism was just going to keep expanding and was going to keep chewing up the earth, essentially. So by high school, I was calling myself an anti-capitalist, but I didn't really know what I was talking about at all. And how
did that start? That would be very interesting to explore. Like
calling myself that?
Well, where did you get the idea of anti-capitalism from initially? Where did that questioning emerge from?
Yeah, I guess it emerged from some kind of basic conservationist kind of ethic, which is not a term I would really apply to myself now, but at the time, my concern about human enslavement and human domination came a little bit later. I was first concerned about basically the non-human world, and it was this kind of, definitely at that time a kind of primitive understanding of things where you just sort of see the natural world as being victimized in this kind of one-sided way. There was no real depth to it, but
it was probably quite emotional.
Yeah. And then just having this sort of loose general sense of, okay, my parents are often struggling with issues related to money, even though they work a lot, and just this kind of general sense of, okay, well, there's this exploitative system happening. I don't really understand what it is. It's exploiting humans. It's exploiting the non-human world. And my big indeterminate word for this is capitalism, because that's what I understand to be the system that we're in. And I understand why that's not the best term for it. It's not the term I would use now. But I knew I was in rebellion against something, but I didn't know what it was. And so I got in trouble at that school for very sort of petty, like talking back to teachers, skipping classes sometimes. But it was all I had no idea what I believed. And it was only a couple years later, by the time I got to be 19, that I think had... Before I was 19, I feel like I had no real consciousness at all. And I went to a well-known in the United States liberal arts school for college, studying philosophy and biology. And I have to say, probably, I consider 85% roughly of that education I got to have been mostly or completely useless. But the one thing it did do was put me in an environment where I basically became interested in reading and questioning things all the time. And I wasn't like that before. Even though I had this kind of pseudo-rebellion that I was describing, I wasn't an intellectual sort of person in the sense of someone who reads and questions and thinks. And one of the major events in my life in this regard was right at the beginning of college, I read David Hume's very skeptical ideas and Friedrich Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil. And those were books that totally blew my mind open, because I had never encountered this kind of deep skepticism about knowledge and these attacks from Nietzsche on sort of liberalism and secularized society and this kind of elitism and attacks on democracy, and I was quite scandalized by it when I first read it, and like an appropriately naive teenager, I started trying to talk to everyone, like all my friends and family, about, hey, have you ever thought about this? Like, oh my goodness, and of course almost no one cared, but some people cared, and then I guess you could say that this was also the very beginning of a spiritual perspective for me, although it didn't feel that way. It was the beginning of it, in that I realized that the dominant educated metaphysical worldview in the West of materialism, by which I mean the idea that everything in the universe is made up of matter, energy, fields, waves, these things that I came to realize were essentially conceptual fictions, and that there was no good explanation for consciousness from this kind of worldview or various other things that we know to be true. And so I essentially became an extremely skeptical existentialist kind of person, because I just thought, well, I don't know, none of this stuff makes sense. All we have is this kind of bare reality as we face it, and we have to make choices, and we at that time I thought we can't know almost anything beyond the sort of immediately given feeling toned sense of life. And so that's how I started reading these left figures, and I was very taken by their critiques of American foreign policy, their critiques of the corporate state. But I didn't like. This is, I guess, sort of an instinctive thing. I've never liked collectivist type philosophies, and the idea of a kind of institutionalized redistribution of wealth just seemed like it could never work unless it were on a very, very small scale. I was also exposed to people like George Carlin and Bill Hicks, who I saw as these amazing sort of fiery, funny truth teller people who they kind of modeled this individual who is just going to get up there and tell it like it is, even if it's offensive, and have a good time doing it, and find something meaningful in doing it. And I was very taken with them. So I graduated feeling pretty aimless and feeling like I'd wasted a lot of time and money and effort going to college. And friends of mine were going to grad school or going on to sort of normal jobs. I didn't want any of that, but I didn't know what I wanted. And I ended up thinking, okay, I know I want to live these anarchist values out in some way, but I don't know how to do that. I moved to the San Francisco Bay Area and started doing odd jobs and sort of gray and black market type of stuff and in this area. And I was surprised being around a bunch of anarchists for the first time. And, I'm still a relatively naive person. I guess at this point I'm 24. Mm-hmm. And I was surprised that everyone around me almost had this woke ideology, even though they considered themselves anarchist. And I thought, well, geez, I really didn't think this was anarchist. I thought these were, these democratic socialist type people who believed in this stuff. And And so that at that point, I really did have to question it. And I thought, maybe I'm wrong about this, what I would now call a kind of cultural Marxist perspective. And so I really, really questioned it, and wondered if I was wrong, and if all these sort of postmodern analyses that these people were trying to wield about how, I just had such intense cognitive biases because I was so overdetermined by my social shaping and conditioning that I was blind to it. And I ended up coming out very much, no, I am right about this, and these people actually have a very authoritarian philosophy that is anti-anarchist, it's anti-liberty, and I was inoculated against it through, early exposure to Nietzsche and analytic philosophy that could cut through sort of postmodern illusions. And part of it for me was that the people I was doing this activism with, that I was really good friends with them, and spent a lot of time with them, had a lot of good conversations about, what can we do to resist the powers that be. But I found that their questioning only went so far. So by this time I was getting exposed to the kind of fringes of anarchism like John Zerzan, Wolfie Landstreicher. I was revisiting Ted Kaczynski, Bob Black, Lawrence Girac, Max Stirner, and almost no one I knew in that activist scene was really interested in these kinds of discussions. And they just sort of, when I would try to talk to them about, we're doing this housing activism, but what about the bigger picture here? They just sort of saw it as, they didn't use this term, but I feel like because they were semi-Marxist people, they were still thinking in semi-Marxist ways. It was like it's bourgeois to them to even be thinking about this kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And so then I started doing Free Radical Radio, which is when you and I got in touch. And that was a podcast that I did for quite a while, close to 100 episodes, broadcasting about once a week. And I went from there to working for a while at Little Black Cart, the anarchist publishing house, where there was very much an environment of questioning and of conversation and dialogue, and I was very challenged to figure out what I really did believe and what I really did want. And I did the brilliant podcast with Aragorn, who is one of the main people behind Little Black Cart, and I had a phase there where I was very pessimistic about anarchism. I was getting disillusioned with people whose anarchism it was really just a kind of extremely aggressive form of woke democratic socialism, just like a really kind of that with an attitude was really what it was a lot of the time. And I really valued my time at Little Black Cart to learn about publishing and that kind of questioning. But I was going in a different direction in that I knew I really wanted to do a land project. And I reached the point where I thought, okay, I reached the point where I am now, basically, which is a couple things, and I'll just tie it off here as neatly as I can, trying to condense a lot of thinking into a short amount of time. I reached a point where I thought, okay, the thing that makes the most sense to me as a strategy is not revolution, because I think that will only lead to a new tyranny, and it will lead to, if it were to be successful in the United States, it would lead to just rivers of blood. And I think the state, or maybe if we would call it the deep state, or whatever we want to call it, is very well tuned to that kind of resistance now. And it even promotes certain forms of it as a way of exercising power in a complex cybernetic general systems theory sort of way. And so I think what it is going to take, and part of what I want to push in this show, is something more like pan-secessionism, like a kind of mass withdrawal and decentralization. Okay, so what about you?
So, in terms of my own journey, I think that there are lots of similarities with your story, and then there's other things that make it kind of different as well. I think that you said something that I found that you said something you said I found interesting was that you didn't really attribute your self-consciousness before like your late teens, and I don't know if it's because you can't really remember those periods, or whether you don't think that you were questioning much of anything. I think the biggest difference here is that when I cast my mind back, and this may be, one of the problems of memory, I might be remembering it kind of wrong or something, but it seems like as far back as I can remember the idea of kind of running into situations where I was questioning things. I remember when I was a young child, old enough to go around on my own, unsupervised, maybe sort of 8 or 9 years old, but but not really thinking about ideas properly. Still, I had this sense that a lot of what the other children around me were doing was somehow wrong or problematic or even crazy sometimes. And I remember seeing, maybe some of this is the result of conditioning. Like I remember seeing children throw litter, and I'd say, why are you doing that? And they'd say things like, oh, it doesn't matter. And I'd be like, really? So maybe that instance of me questioning it was because I'd already been preconditioned to think that litter was bad by my parents and my upbringing and stuff. But then there was other things that they did that really just kind of puzzled me. And I can't tie directly to any kind of positive upbringing. And I think a lot of the time it was like whenever there was the opportunity to kind of think about something and consider it or whatever, generally most children just didn't, and they just barged ahead with things. And so I always felt sort of socially awkward. I felt I was probably, more precocious and intelligent than most of the children around me, and I felt very, very different to them. And I especially just felt like, why is there this kind of lack of decency in so many other children my age? The first sort of really standout moment in my life, which also ties into the idea of a spiritual journey, but it's like the very, very beginning of it, something that would be 180 degrees different from the end, is my first day of school, where I was questioning something that I'd never encountered before. My parents, my family, none of them had ever mentioned God. And so we're in the very first day of school. I'm 5 years old. There's an assembly, and we're all sat there. And all of the children kind of fall with their hands held up to their face like this, and then sort of heads hanging down towards their lap. We're all sitting cross-legged on the floor. And the headmaster is like muttering some words, kind of, thy will be done, I can do that sort of Lord's Prayer type stuff. It may have been that, it may not have been. And I'm like saying to the kid next to me, elbowing him, what's happening? This is like completely bizarre to me. And he sort of says, we're praying. I'm like, what does that mean? Okay, it's talking to God. And the answers that I would receive from these little periods of questioning about this just seemed to me, well, it's not just other children that's crazy. Like there's something else about the world that is crazy. Nowadays, I don't necessarily think that the idea of belief in God is crazy, but I do think that the kind of automatic parroting of behavior and unquestioning of things is kind of odd. And that's definitely something I picked up on at that time.
Right, because it's not just God, right? It's sort of mass ritual behavior and
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And I think that, when you look at like rituals and conventions and the very idea of kind of just doing things because that's the way that they're done,
Hmm.
that is present kind of in all walks of society, but it's most prominent in school. School is
Hmm.
effectively a mechanism by which you learn to be in society, and
Hmm.
you're sculpted and socialized, what a revolting word, into this final product of someone who basically won't ask questions.
Hmm.
It's quite interesting to me when I taught in a elementary school in Korea. In the first and the second grades in this Korean school, like there's no content of learning except how to be at school. So
Right.
the lessons are how to stand in a line, how to walk in that line around the premises of the school, how to respond to certain commands when they're given by the teachers and so on. And they do 2 years of this. Yeah,
Yeah, that's crazy.
they
Yeah.
don't really get onto any actual, content or whatever. But, even in my own experience, the information I'm receiving about the purpose of school, the actual content of the learning, the approaches being taken, I'm questioning all of this. And I can remember just never, ever having satisfactory answers to anything I said. My mum has told me that there was a lot of occasions on which she was called into the school. I was a very naturally disobedient child, questioning of authority, and they'd give me a book and say, I'm not reading that. That's like for a kid that's like way younger than I am. I didn't realize that my reading age was much, much higher than all the other children because, well, presumably both of my parents were teachers at this time. And maybe I was also naturally bright, who knows. And so I would say, I'm not going to read the book. They'd say, you have to read the book. And I'd say, no. And the parents would be called and all this kind of stuff.
Hmm.
There was also a period of like, where when I became older, you've got this point at which you actually start to question the authority of the parents. Well, I started to question
Hmm.
the authority of my parents as well. And then beyond that, the idea of authority at the society level and the idea of official narratives and so forth. Now, it may have been a particular time, but it might be true that you could find examples of this kind within any period. But in my teenage years, there was Waco, Ruby Ridge,
Hmm.
Oklahoma City, the Clinton rapes, and then at the end of my teens, 9/11. Right. So
Right.
this is kind of the period in which I'm being exposed to this stuff. Now, all of the stuff I just mentioned happened in America. It wasn't given that much prominent featuring in our English media. I mean, apart from 9/11, of course.
Hmm.
But it was there, and the older I got and became dissatisfied with this kind of world of unquestioning people, the more I was naturally drawn to seeking out things, especially once I had a TV in my own room, to choose to engage with things that were looking at things from a different angle. And I can remember being kind of, I think, 16 or something during the impeachment trial of Bill Clinton, and seeing documentaries about the women that had come forward and the disgusting ways in which they were silenced and so forth. And so I remember thinking similarly to you, like about all of these ideas and how they tie together, and being kind of shocked. Unlike you, I never really tried to talk to anyone else about them because I wouldn't have known who that would have been.
Hmm.
But I remember thinking, like, my goodness me, there's a rapist, like pretty much one of the worst things that you can be. There's a rapist in the highest office of one of the most powerful countries in the world. And, I didn't really investigate the narratives of Waco, Ruby Ridge, and Oklahoma City that much, but these were big, shocking events. And so, having the idea of governments like raiding homes and killing people,
Hmm.
and in the case of Waco, burning them alive and all the rest of it, that all shocked and traumatized me, really. And I think
Hmm.
that's when I became interested in politics.
Sure. So, I mean, you're talking about being shocked and not wanting to talk to people. So, I mean, the part that I gave in my story, that was very abstract. You know, it was sort of abstract philosophy. And so it's not surprising that most people didn't care to talk about that kind of stuff. But in the case, you're talking more about political scandals, strange events that were well known. So it would have been different to try to talk to people. So
I guess so. Yeah.
What made you not want to talk about those kinds of things that are they're more accessible, they're more generally people agreed that something was wrong with those events, even if they accepted the official story.
Well, I think that in my own case, like the immediate people I would have talked to was my family. My sister's younger and never had much of an interest in ideas.
Mm-hmm.
My parents kind of do have an intellectual element to them, but they were so rigid in their sort of socialism and their kind of like team picking of like, oh, well, Clinton, he's the good guy because he represents the blue team, that they were just not open to that kind of thing. And I think by then I'd already lost faith in them as having any ability to look at something objective and help me figure things out. Because, you know, I'd seen countless examples of, you know, just silly behavior with regards to English events and issues. There's no way that something like Clinton's rapes, they were going to talk to me about it. And also I was quite shy, I guess, as well. That contributed to it too. And then, you know, for a combination of reasons, including being kind of spiritually and philosophically lost and afloat in a world of confusing information, I just sort of moved heavily away from the world of ideas for about 5 years. And the sort of, when you said that there was a period, you know, where you were kind of using drugs more or less in an interesting capacity, I definitely became the victim of using them in an abusive, self-destructive way for a good while.
So did I. I just skipped over that part. Yeah,
falling in with the wrong people and basically living a very ideationally bereft period of 5 years, which at the end of which I decided, look, I'm hanging out with these people that I don't really know very well. We never talk about anything meaningful. I started to feel this pull of wanting to be engaged in somehow. And when I came out the other end, for various reasons, including some personal decisions I made, I found myself quite drawn to like a kind of neoconservative position. And I think that it's because, first of all, they're very good at propaganda and pulling people in.
Yeah.
And I also think that if you're very confused, and you've been very confused for a good few years, someone who says to you like, well, let's get things organized, might is right, has a good utility in kind of setting the agenda. Also, the oversimplification of like good versus evil and military sides, and you know, this kind of extreme pragmatist mentality must have appealed to me, I guess.
And it feels like they're doing something, right? And you were in a place where you felt like you weren't really going anywhere. So you say, okay, well, at least these people are doing something, and they're talking about freedom, they're talking about democracy, they're talking about these things that seem good, and they're not just armchair people.
Yeah, and at this time in my life, like I hadn't really felt any major financial crunch. And I kind of thought, well, things are pretty good in our country, in our way. And I became quite interested in the idea of like exporting freedom, you know, and in the years of the Bush presidencies, that was a very common theme that they talked about. And seen from an uncritical angle, you know, these people looked like they were doing a lot of good to some people. Sure. So I was in this kind of neoconservative mindset, and basically obviously there's still some part, well, there was still some part of me and is still some part of me that just questions things, and butting into different people that I met when I went to university in my late 20s, bumping into people there, being confronted with different arguments, especially encountering one particular guy who became my very good friend for a number of years, who had a sort of anarcho-capitalist perspective. I then sort of slowly shifted from more like neoconservative to like neo-libertarian to like libertarian. And at this point, what I realized was that ever since I started thinking about ideas in my teens, I had been lost. Mm-hmm. And so at this point, I said, I don't want to be lost anymore. I want to give myself a tool by which I can continue to question things, but ground what I know and what I believe step by step. And so I read some stuff, including Ayn Rand, that encouraged the idea of a person building up their own philosophy from first principles.
Right.
Using philosophy as like a tool set to do that. Mm-hmm. And I did that for many years. And as that unfolded, I began to see that politics is not quite so deep as culture. And I faced the challenges of feminism, environmentalism, anti-civilizational critiques, and so forth. And steadily, they all became part of my way of thinking as well. So I began to question more and more.
In the sense that you were sort of transcending and including all of these philosophies. Yeah.
So I remember watching the documentary / polemic piece of movie called What a Way to Go, which is generally sort of environmentalist in nature. It doesn't really, I wouldn't necessarily call it full on anti-civ, but it's a lot more thoughtful than anything that, a sort of party political perspective would include. And I remember thinking, wow, this is something I'd never really thought about before. It makes the case so persuasively that really it would be foolish to sort of argue about against the importance of it, really. And read Endgame by Derek Jensen, and Against History, Against Leviathan by Freddie Pullman.
Sure.
Lots and lots of feminist literature. It was all convincing me that the number of things that still existed to question was much, much bigger than I previously thought.
So at this point we're getting to you're around the end of your university perspective. You've incorporated all of these different philosophical threads, and would you say at this point you're kind of arriving at something close to your perspective now, or do you still have a long way to go?
Well, I like the way that you kind of, at the end, summarized your own perspective as being kind of political, ecological, and spiritual. Yeah. So I suppose that similarly, by the period that I've described up until now, I'd sort of done most of my questioning of the political and the ecological, and settled on, let's say, an outlook which obviously at the time that I made contact with you was relatively similar, and not a whole lot has changed from then until now, which is a period of about, I guess, 6 years or something since we made contact, something like that.
Yeah.
Which only really leaves the spiritual aspect, and I'll come on to that in a little while. But one other thing that I haven't mentioned so far, I guess I touched on it by talking about things like Waco, is all the time from my late teens and up until now as well, I was fascinated and spent perhaps more time on anything than I spent on anything else, researching, the truth in a way that some people derogatorily call conspiracy theory, and I absolutely detest this term. There isn't really like one phrase that I would like to...
It's a term that was propagated by intelligence agencies.
Exactly, yeah. How can we get people to not listen to this and to think it's wrong to question it? Well, we'll call it conspiracy theory. But I guess 9/11 was the first one that really got me thinking, because what they were saying happened, and what was apparent from the information that was coming out was so different. It was kind of obvious that even if they were only lying a little bit, they were definitely lying. And the more you look into some of these events, the more it becomes untenable to accept official narratives. And I guess then there's a cumulative effect. The more of these things that you look into, the more of the things that you question, when you find out that there's a lot of disinformation on all of them, it makes you wonder what's going on at a broader level. And so, as well as just kind of questioning official narratives, truth seeking on these isolated events, I think it's very important not to, as my old friend used to say, put the event on a pedestal, but to step back and see what are the overarching themes going on here. And we touched on this before when we talked about, more and more consolidation of power and control and so on. So this is something that happened over those periods. I still do it now. And I think it's a very important part of questioning, and one that during the course of the show, I hope to show people that far from being just it's being something you would associate with tinfoil hat crazy people that don't have critical faculties and just believe any crazy thing they come across. Actually, it's core to an understanding of the world. And some of the truths that you can mine from looking into things for yourself and finding reliable sources is quite shattering, really, and can completely change the way that you look at the world. It certainly has mine.
So, yeah, I think that whole set of things is something we'll have to go through a bit at a time. And I certainly agree with you that it's ridiculous to simply blanket a whole set of different theories, whether it's historical revisionism or examination of current events, and blanket it all with this pejorative term, which essentially just means you believe two or more people planned together to do something nefarious and then executed it and attempted to do it in a clandestine manner. I mean, there's no one who, with any sense, who doesn't think that happens at least sometimes. So, yeah, to use that as a dismissive pejorative, I completely agree with you, is inappropriate. So you talked about the spiritual thing coming later. Is that something you want to discuss right now, or did you want to table that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that basically I'll be quite, I'll summarize it a lot, but basically, similar to yourself, there came a time where I decided to question my kind of core metaphysical beliefs. And when I really plucked up the courage to put them under the microscope, and I thought, well, there's a lot of things that I just haven't questioned, especially the sort of scientific, sort of materialist ideas of things like the Big Bang and the way they present the cosmology as happening by accident and so forth. And I settled on this kind of, and I think that this is not a straw man, but a fairly accurate summary of their view, is it's like the idea that everything came from nothing all at once and for no reason. And the more that I meditated on that idea,
and it just happened to work out this way.
Yeah.
By accident. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
The more I thought about that, I thought, well, how could I have ever believed that? At this point when I really came to grips with it, I was like, well, there's no way that I believe that, and I can't believe that I ever believed that. And of course, the truth is that I never really thought about it. It had been something I'd compartmentalized in my mind and not questioned. And so as soon as I question that, then I'm really back to sort of more questions than ever before. Well, if everything didn't come from nothing, then what does that mean? And what possible ways of looking at the world are there? And so I explored the idea that maybe the universe is eternal and has always been like this, and so on and so forth, and bit by bit. And the more I think that a person is open to spiritual questions, the more they actually begin to feel the effects of spirituality. And so there's far too many to be covered in a short summary like this. But I started to have experiences that, together with the kind of more philosophical, abstract questioning, really just made me kind of, I guess it shifted me more from kind of just questioning to beginning to construct like beliefs that might be possible answers. And that's kind of where I'm at now. I don't have like a rigid spiritual belief or even like a regular practice or anything like that. But I do dabble, and I definitely explore these ideas, and I'm fascinated by them. And now, really, anytime I meet someone who's kind of close to that, I don't really feel the significance of what that has meant to my life, to throw that open and say, okay, I'm no longer content with just hand waving. I want to get into this. If someone else is not ready to take that same step, their kind of, maybe a bit harsh to say, but their relevance to my experience becomes massively reduced and diminished. And I'm like, I want to have these kind of conversations because I feel like there is a dimension in which all of this stuff comes together. As you said, the political, the ecological, the spiritual, it's all one and the same.
Yeah, there's that term consilience, which I don't know if E.O. Wilson coined it or if he just used it. But I even though I reject his version of consilience, I think it all has to fit together. And there's something, that because of the hegemony of the postmodern worldview right now, there's this idea that it can all just sort of, or that either it's okay for philosophy and politics and life and spirituality to not all fit together, and they're all just sort of hermetically sealed off from each other, or any attempt to fit them together is some kind of illusion. But I think it absolutely has to all fit together. And so where do you find yourself? So I sort of gave a little spiel at the end about where I was at with all these things and why I was doing the show. So why do the show? Is there a certain you and I have had conversations off camera, so I kind of know where you're coming from, but I guess I'd just like to hear you pitch what doing this means to you.
To me, there's no longer any questions I don't want to consider. I've seen how it played out in my life when, for periods, sometimes lasting years, I didn't consider certain questions. And I've seen the increased clarity that came from choosing to finally face them. And so this is something that really, when I look back on it, I've done mainly alone. And at different times I've done in dialogue and collaboration with one specific person at a time. For the last few years, it's been yourself. Prior to that, of course, there was another whose name should not be mentioned. But now I'd like to sort of widen it a little bit and try to have more conversations of this kind. And especially the aspect of this project that I want to maximize is to break the mold of viewer and producer or content producer, which, even shows that have fascinating conversations and content on them, like, say, where Joe Rogan talks to Graham Hancock, it's still just an interview. It's not a full conversation. And I want also for the conversations to be very, very linked to the lives of the people who are having them. Whereas I think that someone like Rogan can go away and go, well, that was a fascinating conversation I had with Graham Hancock. Let's go to Burger King and forget all about it. You know, the ideas that I want to generate in this program, I want myself and others that are involved in it to take away and really use those to hopefully find as much insight as possible.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. Sounds very good. Anything else you want to add, or should we wind down?
Yeah, I think we can wind down at this point. We've been going a good while.
So, yeah, I guess I will just say these past 2 episodes, we've basically just been getting our feet wet and doing what felt like necessary groundwork. So it might, at this point, feel like a lot of exposition relative to the amount of content, but this we felt was necessary grounding, and now we're ready to go start exploring specific topics and speaking with others. So thanks for joining us, and we hope you will tune into future episodes.